Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Keeve Nachman, and on behalf of my co-presenters and the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, Exploring Trends in Animal Agricultural Production in Lower and Middle Income Countries. One of the purposes of today's webinar is to announce the release of our new report entitled Industrial Food Animal Production in Low and Middle Income Countries, a Landscape Assessment. For those of you that are interested in the report, it is available for free at the online link displayed here. The work that led to the writing and release of this report was supported by generous gifts from both the Boston Foundation and the Grace Communications Foundation. I wanted to take a moment to quickly talk about the CLF. The speakers on today's call are representatives from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. For those of you unfamiliar with the center, the CLF is an academic center housed at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health that works with students, educators, researchers, policymakers, advocacy organizations, and communities to build a healthier, more equitable, and resilient food system. The mission of the CLF is to promote research and to develop and communicate information about the complex interrelationships among diet, food production, environment, and human health, to advance an ecological perspective in reducing threats to the health of the public and to promote policies that protect health, the global environment, and the ability to sustain life for future generations. On today's call, you will hear from three people. Yukyan Lam is a fifth-year doctoral student in the Department of International Health at the Bloomberg School of Public Health and has been a CLF Learner Fellow at the center for the past 3 years. She received her undergraduate degree in physics from MIT and a law degree from Harvard. She has lived and worked in various countries, including Colombia, Brazil, Mozambique, and Bangladesh. Dr. Jillian directs the Public Health and Sustainable Aquaculture Project at CLF and is on the faculty of the Departments of Environmental Health and Engineering and Health, Behavior, and Society at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Jillian also coordinates CLF's response to requests for technical assistance from communities impacted by industrial food animal production and has summarized the relevant public health literature and regulatory gaps for policymakers and citizens through numerous letters and presentations. I'm Keeve Nachman again. Hi. I direct the Food Production and Public Health Program at the CLF, where we investigate how agricultural practices and modalities impact human health and environmental quality. I also co-direct the Johns Hopkins Risk Sciences and Public Policy Institute and am an assistant professor in the Departments of Environmental Health and Engineering and Health Policy and Management here at the Bloomberg School. I work on a variety of topics in the context of animal agriculture, ranging from animal drugs and antibiotic resistance, environmental monitoring, policy analysis, worker health, toxicological assessments of agriculture-related chemicals, and access to information. Before we get started with today's content, I wanted to just briefly cover a few housekeeping announcements. First, I wanted to note that we will be sharing a PDF of today's slide deck with anyone who's participating at the webinar and interested in seeing the slides later. We've also set aside some time after today's presentation for any questions that you may have. Okay, now I'd like to turn things over to Jillian, who's going to set the stage for our discussion of industrial food animal production in lower and middle income countries by giving a bit of background on the public health, environmental, and animal welfare considerations associated with this modality of animal production. Jillian?
Thanks, Keeve. So most of you, if not all of you, are very familiar with what we call industrial food animal production, or IFAP. But just so that we're on the same page, just to make sure, I'm going to just provide a brief background on the topic. This type of production is characterized by specialized operations with high volumes, meaning they focus on one animal species and have hundreds to hundreds of thousands of animals in confined conditions at one production site. The conditions are highly controlled, including lighting, temperature, feed, and water. In addition, IFAP operations tend to cluster geographically to decrease the cost of distributing young animals and feed and transporting animals to a centralized slaughter facility. Also, companies involved with various stages of animal agriculture have consolidated over the past several decades. So fewer corporations control an expanding share of production or processing. At the same time, companies have adopted vertical integration in their supply chains, including by contracting with farmers to build the confinement structures on their land to grow the animals until they are slaughtered or while they produce milk or eggs. There are many issues included in the contracting system that we're not going to cover today, and I assume many of you are very familiar with those. IFAP is indeed the dominant form of production for meat, dairy, and eggs in the U.S. and in several other high-income countries. This production system has many serious negative externalities. The focus on high throughput production puts enormous pressure on the resources that we use to produce our food, including land, water, and fertilizers. Many more people could be fed a nutritionally adequate diet if animal products, especially from grain-fed animals, were dramatically reduced or eliminated from the diet, compared to a diet high in meat, dairy, and eggs. This inefficiency stems from the loss in protein and calories that results from growing crops to feed to animals that humans ultimately consume, as compared to consuming more plant-based foods. In addition, due to the practice of producing large numbers of animals in geographically clustered large operations, harmful gases, particulate matter, pathogens, and nutrients have contaminated the air, water, and soil in regions with IFAP and also in regions that are downstream or downwind. Pathogens are released by these operations into the environment by ventilation systems, transport trucks, workers who can become carriers or develop an infection, and when large amounts of manure are applied and over-applied on fields and end up in stormwater runoff. Pathogens emitted from IFAP operations are especially concerning due to the common practice of using antimicrobials in an ongoing manner to keep animals from becoming sick due to poor crowded conditions and to enhance growth. This practice has been shown to confer drug resistance to bacteria, which poses a serious threat to human health. If people are infected by these drug-resistant pathogens, the infection can be harder and more expensive to treat. IFAP also causes widespread animal suffering. Nearly all of the approximately 9 billion animals produced each year in the U.S. spend the majority of their lives in cramped, crowded, and unhygienic conditions. The billions of animals produced globally for human consumption likely account for the largest proportion of animal welfare deficiencies occurring at any given moment worldwide. Finally, IFAP has enabled populations in high-income countries to adopt diets that are high in meat, dairy, and eggs, and this dietary pattern is linked to a host of chronic diseases. Our interest in the role of IFAP in low and middle-income countries and impacts on public health and animal welfare developed in response to evidence showing increased adoption of this model in LMICs and the existing information gaps. Many corporations involved with IFAP in high-income countries have become active in LMICs, and many corporate mergers have occurred across national boundaries. One reason corporations have turned their attention to LMICs is because the rising demand for meat, dairy, and eggs is concentrated in these countries, and this trend is expected to continue as incomes rise. As public health professionals, we are particularly concerned about the adoption of this system with the significant negative externalities I described, combined with potentially limited resources and infrastructure in many countries that are needed to monitor and control impacts on the environment, human health, and animal welfare. Thank you, and now I will turn it back over to Keeve.
Thank you, Jillian. At CLF, we've become increasingly interested in how the mistakes we make in domestic agricultural production may recur as a result of the adoption of industrialized methods outside of U.S. borders. We've also been inspired and influenced by the great international work of some of our peers at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, Brighter Green, the Humane Society International, Compassion in World Farming, and many other organizations. We were fortunate enough to collaborate with the Boston Foundation and the Grace Communications Foundation, who were interested in supporting an examination of the nature of animal agriculture in countries around the world that may be ramping up their production of animal protein. It was also a point of mutual interest for us and our supporters to look at these changes in lower and middle income countries in the event that public health infrastructures in these settings may be less able to protect against some of the externalities that Jillian previously described. So, for this project, we set out to perform a landscape assessment of industrial food animal production, or IFAP, specifically focusing on the beef, pork, and chicken industries. It was our intent to describe these industries in countries where IFAP is either considerably established or increasing its presence at a rapid pace. Our goal in conducting this work is that its findings will serve as a communication tool and springboard for future research and funding initiatives aimed at addressing public health, environmental, and animal welfare concerns in low and middle income countries. We are also hopeful that the insights garnered from this landscape assessment will aid in catalyzing progress towards proper regulation of IFAP around the world and possibly a decreased demand for industrially produced animal products. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Yukyan Lam, who's going to tell you all about our report.
Okay, so to start with, I'll explain some of the methods and then later delve into the findings. When we selected countries, we selected them based on income, population, the total mass of live animals being produced, animal species, and geography. The three species that we considered in this report were chicken, pigs, and cattle. In general, we targeted low and middle income countries that were raising the most animals and producing the greatest amount of poultry, pork, and beef. And another factor that we considered was density, calculated as the number of animals per unit of agricultural area in a given country. So here's a map of the countries that were selected, and as you can see, we covered different major geographic regions through the country selection process. So in Latin America, we have Brazil and Mexico. In Asia, we have China, India, Myanmar, and Vietnam. In sub-Saharan Africa, we selected Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. And finally, in the Mediterranean region, we have Turkey. Okay, and so the sources of information that this landscape assessment relied on were found through searching online databases of scientific literature, through Google and Google Scholar searches, and through searching online databases of news outlets. The types of information that we gathered consisted of peer-reviewed scientific articles and conference proceedings, NGO and intergovernmental organization reports, such as reports by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, government documents, and also news articles. So here you can see this table, which provides a quick snapshot of the number of sources found for each of our selected countries, broken down by type of source. So what can we take away from this breakdown? Well, first, as you can see, there's significant variation in the number of available information sources by country. Second, you see that this report draws on a large number of sources. It was about 450 or so in total. Moreover, the sources are diverse, and they extend beyond just scientific articles published in public health journals. So let me explain why this was actually the case. In this work, we selected some countries where the influx of IFAP is relatively recent. And also, we were targeting low and middle income countries. And within these countries, there might be limited resources for conducting and publishing scientific research in peer-reviewed journals. So because of these factors and others that you might think of, we anticipated that the coverage of IFAP and LMICs in the scientific literature might be minimal for quite a few of our selected countries. For example, if you can kind of see Myanmar on the chart there, you see that we only found 5 scientific articles meeting our criteria.
So limiting ourselves to only scientific articles would have given us a very sparse and incomplete picture of what was happening in Myanmar. So for this reason, for this country and others, we included information from lay, non-scientific sources, such as NGO documents and news articles. And another point I wanted to make is that we didn't only rely on sources from the field of public health. If we had limited ourselves to public health studies, then we would have had much less information. Livestock production as a topic might be studied to a much greater extent in the fields of agronomy or economic development, for example, than the field of public health, even though it clearly has public health implications. And since we here at CLF have a track record studying these issues, we could incorporate sources from these other fields while applying a systems perspective and a public health lens. Okay, so to analyze the diverse sources that we identified, we used a framework that covered topics that were most important from public health and systems perspectives. So first, we looked for quantitative information to capture levels of production. Second, we paid special attention to trends in industrialization, including expansion of the scale of food animal production, tendencies toward vertically integrated production chains, the degree of market consolidation and concentration, and the presence of transnational corporations. We also looked at the inputs used in producing food animals, such as animal breeds, feed, veterinary drugs, land and facilities for housing, processing, and slaughtering animals. We were also concerned with the impacts of food animal production on public health, including the health of surrounding communities as well as workers, and impacts on animal welfare and the environment. We also considered the extent to which national policies promoted industrializing food animal production and the regulatory frameworks in place to regulate this production and its impacts. And last but not least, we also try to characterize how the public engaged with the issue of food animal production. So, for example, are different segments of civil society supportive of industrialization? Have there been campaigns against food animal production practices? Do consumers have preferences about how animals are raised? Or how is the media covering these issues? So now I'm going to actually go through each of these points and say a few words about our findings on them. I'm going to be speaking more or less generally, but remember that if you want country-specific information, the report is broken down into country-specific chapters, and the appendix includes these detailed country chapters at the end. Okay. So first on current production statistics. So the quantitative data that we use to capture production levels came from UN FAO databases. And here's a table showing the number of live animals raised in 2013 in the 10 countries that we selected. And at the time we conducted this research, the most updated statistics came from 2013 for live animals. Okay. And here's another production table. This is on levels of production from 2002 to 2007 and then to 2012, taking chicken as an example. So at the time we conducted the landscape assessment, the most updated production stats came from 2012. So there are a lot of numbers here. What can you take away from these tables, which you can find in the report and look at with your own time? Well, the main takeaway points that we have from looking at the quantitative data are that there have been significant increases in the number of live animals and amount of meat produced. There are, of course, variations based on country and animal sector. And finally, although the tables focused on the 2002 to 2012 period, for some of these countries, even more dramatic increases in animals in production had occurred prior to 2002. Okay. So on the topic of industrialization, we found that in general there has been significant expansion of food animal production activity. And there's variation by species, with the growth most notable in the poultry and pig sectors. The extent of expansion varies geographically, not only between countries, but also within different regions of a given country. We've also observed many of the features of industrialization that Jillian spoke of earlier, such as more large-scale, commercial-oriented, specialized, and input-intensive production units. The increase in larger, profit-oriented production units has sometimes occurred alongside a decrease in smaller subsistence-oriented farms. In some of these cases, the small-scale farmers have actually exited the sector, while in other cases they have become more specialized by transitioning from diversified production to focusing on raising only one type of animal. We found at least some trace of vertically integrated production in nearly every country, especially in the poultry sector, and in some instances, small-scale farms were absorbed into these vertical production chains. We also noted some reports of increased market concentration and consolidation, but the degree still appears to be less than that of the US. We saw also the reach of some transnational corporations into some of our selected LMICs. These corporations, which tended to be from the US, Europe, China, or Brazil, sometimes ran animal production operations, including vertically integrated ones, and other times they were more in the business of supplying feed, vaccines, and other inputs. The main point here that I want to make is that we found that industrialized food animal production is definitely on the rise, and it's accounting for an increasing share of livestock production, even if it's not necessarily the dominant mode of production right now. Currently, it's coexisting alongside small-scale farms. Okay, and on the topic of inputs, we found many sources stating that one of the greatest challenges in food animal production is consistent access to high-quality feed. So one option is to import feed. Another option for a country is to produce feed domestically. However, this leads to direct competition between using land, water, and other natural resources to produce feed crops on the one hand, and using those same resources to produce crops that will be consumed directly by humans on the other hand. So how to resolve this competition between animal feed and human plant-based food is a key issue for countries that are experiencing food insecurity. So I want to give an example. For example, in Ethiopia, pasture land is described as being degraded or overgrazed. And cultivation of fodder crops is not common due to competing pressure for farmland. Instead, most domestically produced grain is used for domestic human consumption. And small livestock farmers can't afford grain-based feed, and only the large-scale commercial operations located around the capital use grain-based feed regularly. So for stakeholders there in Ethiopia trying to expand food animal production, increasing consistent access to high-quality feed inputs is one of their most pressing concerns. In the literature, the imported technology most often described regarding breeding. There's a perspective in various countries that exotic breeds and artificial insemination technologies have contributed to gains in livestock productivity. And I want to note here that productivity is not just the quantity of meat actually being produced, but it's also measured by things like the weights that animals attain before slaughter and the amount of time that they take to actually reach that weight. So we found a few reports briefly describing how measures of productivity in LMICs are still not, quote unquote, caught up to where US levels are. Also, we found a few reports describing how large-scale farms in some of these LMICs have facilities and technology comparable to the infrastructure found in the US. Okay. Another input, veterinary drugs, is particularly important, especially antibiotics. So these drugs can be administered not only to animals diagnosed as sick by a veterinarian, they might also be administered to animals that have not yet been diagnosed or to animals that are actually healthy for prophylactic or growth promotion purposes. And this is a serious concern, as Jillian described earlier. When such drugs are misused or overused, we might be creating and selecting out for antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which can cause life-threatening infections in humans as well as animals. So without proper veterinary oversight, these types of problems can be exacerbated. And given that we found numerous reports about improper use of veterinary drugs, coupled with this lack in general of in-country veterinary expertise, we have very disconcerting concerns here. Okay. And on the topic of impacts of food animal production, we found that there were actually very few empirical studies on the impacts of IFAP on public health, on the environment, on animal welfare, and on worker health. So why is this a concern? Well, first of all, given that there have been such increases in food animal production, we would expect there to actually be more research on impacts. There's certainly need for that, so that's a bit worrisome. Second, more information on impacts is needed because regulations of IFAP are reported to be lacking or ineffective in many LMICs. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that on the next slide. Third, the few studies that do already exist on impacts show preliminary evidence of antibiotic residues and or drug-resistant pathogens in animals, their manure, or the environment. So this is definitely a topic that's an urgent research priority, especially given the public health implications that we mentioned earlier. Fourth, many sources in the literature also express concern about improper disposal of manure and wastewater. So the impacts of these practices need to be understood in greater detail. And finally, research on environmental impacts is needed because environmental degradation is actually already a problem in many regions. So for example, we have problems like overgrazing, soil erosion, and water scarcity affecting areas of several of the countries we studied. So expanding food animal production could easily place even more pressure on natural resources in terms of the amount of resources that you need to feed such large numbers of animals. All right, and now on the topic of regulations. So I just want to first say that we actually relied mostly on secondary sources, like NGO reports that describe the state of regulation or policy, rather than primary analysis conducted ourselves of those national laws and policies. What I'm trying to say here is that basically the scope of this landscape assessment didn't entail doing a systematic review of national laws and policies, which would require basically searching in the country's official language and maybe linking up with country-specific experts. So that's a pending research need. Having clarified this, I will describe two general findings that we had about regulations. So first, it appears that there's been notable proactive government support for industrializing food animal production. And the extent to which governments have been involved varies by country, but almost across the board, at least in the 10 countries that we studied, we found that governments really are promoting expanding the livestock sector and livestock production. Now, in some countries like Vietnam and China, industrializing food animal production is actually an explicit part of the country's economic development strategy. And in a country like Ethiopia, as another example, improving livestock production is seen as a form of poverty alleviation and a way to increase national GDP. So the types of support that governments have given, it takes various forms, again, depending on the country. There's been loans and credit, subsidies, technical assistance, provision of government-owned infrastructure, market deregulation, favorable access to land, tariffs, and other trade policies. Our second general finding on regulations is that there appears to be a lack of regulations or ineffective enforcement of regulations on many, many topics related to food animal production, including, as I've listed here, inputs, slaughtering, animal welfare, waste management, and the impacts of livestock production activities on the environment and public health. So here, I want to say that it's important to keep in mind that in the U.S., where IFAP is regulated, there are already concerns about the strength of regulations and enforcement, to the point where we might say that there's just not good oversight of IFAP in the U.S. Now, in the LMICs that we studied, the problem seems to run a bit deeper than that. According to the sources we identified, there's often a complete absence of regulations or enforcement of regulations on these topics. On the issue of public engagement, when we assess media coverage, we relied on international databases like Global Meat News and Feed Navigator, and search engines like Google and Google News. So, as you can see, one limitation was that we didn't actually have the resources to exhaustively search any national level news outlets. So again, this is an area for future work. But in any case, what we found was that media coverage varied greatly by issue and country, and issues that seemed to feature prominently in the news sources included food safety scandals and mergers and takeovers involving very large agribusiness firms. Our second finding related to public engagement was that civil society actors are interested in developing the livestock sector, though not always through creating large-scale commercial farms. Sometimes it was through upgrading or increasing the capacity of small or medium-sized farms or making them more specialized. The idea of helping small farms reflects the perspective that developing the livestock sector can really lift rural households out of poverty. And that's a perspective that was particularly prominent in the sub-Saharan African countries that we studied, so namely Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. Another finding was the perception that larger animal production facilities are safer and more biosecure in terms of enforcing better hygiene and minimizing the transport of infectious agents to and from these facilities. Now, this perception was perpetuated by the media, by government, and some international and national agricultural voices. Now, there may be some truth to this perspective, but I want to say that we didn't actually find much in the way of scientific studies to either prove or disprove the claim. Okay. And our fourth finding on the topic of public engagement was that we weren't able to identify many campaigns mobilizing around IFAP issues. And this might be because such campaigns don't yet exist, but really until we can interact with local organizations and partners in the countries, we can't say for sure. And finally, we also found that there were a handful of consumer-oriented studies which showed kind of budding concern about how food animals are produced. Now, this concern was sometimes related more to the quality of meat and food safety, and probably less so to regard for animal welfare or environmental sustainability. Okay, so there's a lot of information here that we just shared from our findings. These are our main takeaway points.
Oh no, our audio connection has been lost.
Okay, so basically, as I was saying, our main takeaway points. First, let me navigate back to the slide. Okay. First, many facets of industrialized production are already underway and appear likely to continue. Second, there are many concerns about the capacity of existing regulatory frameworks to address increases in food animal production. And third, research on the specific impacts of IFAP and LMICs has been limited, but it's already sufficient to trigger concern. Okay, so having presented the findings, I'm going to turn it back to Keeve to tell us where we go from here.
Thanks, Yukyan. Before we continue, I wanted to mention that what you just heard is really only the tip of the iceberg of the content in this report. Recognizing that people have varying degrees of interest in, and also time available to read the report, I wanted to highlight that several options exist. Within the report, for the busy executive, we have the 3-page summary option. The fuller report, which goes into greater depth, clocks in at around 40 pages. For the hardcore and truly dedicated, we also have country-specific chapters that Yukyan mentioned, ranging in length from about 10 to 40 pages each, depending on the amount of information we were able to identify. What's noteworthy, however, is that each of these chapters is annotated with its own bibliography for those who would like to follow up with the primary literature. The question now is, where do we go from here? Our landscape assessment allowed us to identify 10 new research and intervention priorities, each of which can be categorized as being one of 3 types of action. The first relates to generating new information and analyses. The second consists of disseminating information among interested parties. And the third entails developing, piloting, and scaling up interventions. Before describing the priorities in each of these categories, I should highlight that one cross-cutting feature is the importance of involving local partners, such as researchers, think tanks, and other organizations based in the countries of interest. Engaging local partners was not part of this landscape assessment effort, but would be an indispensable part of future actions we are about to propose. In terms of generation of additional information and analyses, we have a number of recommendations. First, we identified a need for more in-depth analyses of government policies promoting the industrialization of food animal production and identification of policy levers to mitigate the impacts of IFAP. Next, there's a need for private sector assessments, which identify major multinational meat-producing companies, their countries of origin, locations of activity, and country-specific production practices. Third, we recommend an assessment of major national and international flows of feed or feed raw materials. Also critical is a focused analysis of the regulation of animal welfare related to IFAP in lower and middle income countries. We recommend studies of consumer perceptions and preferences regarding animal production and consumption of animal protein, and also a planetary boundaries assessment for IFAP expansion in lower and middle income countries. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, the planetary boundaries paradigm is an Earth systems framework that looks at how close we are to exceeding certain environmental limits that would make the Earth uninhabitable. There are 9 different domains in this paradigm, including climate change, freshwater, and land use, all of which are germane to animal production. For information dissemination and engagement, we have 2 recommendations. First, we see value in identifying case examples of existing sustainable modes of food animal production in LMICs and developing culturally appropriate educational materials to engage other farmers. Second, we believe implementing education campaigns for lower and middle income country governments regarding public health and environmental concerns related to IFAP is a worthy endeavor. Finally, in the area of intervention development, we recommend convening nutrition and domestic agriculture experts to identify culturally appropriate and regionally feasible plant-centric diets capable of providing adequate nutrition to the local population, and identifying harm reduction strategies to mitigate impacts of IFAP in lower and middle income countries. Okay, well that concludes the primary presentation portion of our webinar. Before we move on to Q&A, I'd like to take a moment and recognize those involved in various ways in making this report and webinar happen. We'd once again like to thank the Boston Foundation and the Grace Communications Foundation for their support of our work. We'd also like to thank report co-authors Brent Kim and Emily Hu for their valuable contributions and hard work. We are lucky to have Mike Milley, Ruchi Gupta, Darcy Milburn, and the rest of the communications team for their work to help make today happen and on designing and formatting the look of the report. The work of the CLF mapping team, especially Jamie and Caitlin, is greatly appreciated. We also benefited from the wisdom of internal review from Sean McKenzie, Bob Martin, and Claire Fitch. Also, before we start the Q&A, we wanted to share web links for some of CLF's activities. Here you'll see links to our main web page, and you can link to our report from that main web page, and also an array of policy, mapping, and educational resources housed at the center. Remember, we will be sharing these slides, so no need to copy these links down. CLF also has a very active social media presence. Here's the information you'll need to follow us on the information superhighway, and I realize I sound like a real Luddite when I put it that way. And with that, I'd like to now invite questions for the remainder of our time. If you could, please submit any questions you have through the question box on the bottom right portion of your screen. We'll give you a minute to think of some and type them out if you have them. I should also mention, of course, that if you think of questions later, or questions might arise from you spending some time with the report, we're happy to entertain those questions through email, and we've listed the center's web address here, clf@jhu.edu. And so I see we have one question. Are the next steps of this project already in process, or are you on hold while you seek funding? So that is a terrific question. Oops, we just lost the question.
No, go ahead.
Okay. We very recently finished with the report, and we have some ideas about some of the various interventions that we'd like to pursue, but we are in the process of seeking additional funding to pursue some of these endeavors. And one point I wanted to highlight, and I think Yukyan has touched on this before, is the importance of in-country partners. I think we've learned through the process of writing this report and coming up with the recommendations that prioritizing those recommendations on a country-by-country basis is really going to require having solid contacts within country to help us do feasibility assessments and figure out costs of what some of these interventions might entail. And with that in place, I think we're going to be well positioned to pursue additional support to do these sorts of things. Okay, thanks for that question. I think we had, we have a bunch. Thank you guys so much for asking questions. So, okay, so we have
the blue ones.
Okay, so we have, hi all, great work, really interesting and valuable, and thanks for the shout out to Brighter Green. Absolutely, thank you, Mia. You're wondering if you're planning to follow up, so that actually is a very close question to the last one. So Mia, hopefully my answer to the previous question answered your question. Let us know if it didn't. And from Yael, we have you identified your local partner for these next steps? Not yet, but that is next on our agenda. And from Jim, hi Jim, excellent report. Aside from the countries you looked at, did you find evidence about where the future of IFAP growth may be headed geographically? And if so, where and what dynamics are driving that? So Yukyan, do you want to take a crack at answering Jim's question?
Yeah, sure. So I think this sort of Southeast Asia region, we found a few countries that were really close to making it kind of onto our list of top 10. You have like Thailand and Indonesia, for example. I know in sub-Saharan Africa, we focused on mostly East Africa, but also we have, I think Nigeria came very close as well to making the list. So there's definitely certain countries would say, okay, these might be new geographic foci that you'd want to consider. But actually beyond that, one of the things we realized was that, okay, when we were selecting countries, we looked at animal density, right, which is, this measure of animals per geographic area. And we realized pretty quickly that, that's fine as a broad stroke for this step, but really we want to get beyond just a country level measure to really look at more region or province specific things, because countries like Brazil and China, we actually added kind of quote unquote manually to our list of countries. They're just countries with a very large geographic area that, in terms of density, we just look at that number, doesn't really reflect the amount of animal production going on. And then when we started looking at the countries themselves in more detail, like China and Vietnam, we realized, there are definite hot spots of production that might occur, say, near river deltas, maybe near urban areas and so forth. So kind of the takeaway from this as a next step, I think if you were to look at geography, you need a much, higher resolution lens is how I would describe it.
More sophisticated.
Yeah, more sophisticated, really just to look at provinces and regions. And I think the trends are really depending on the natural resources available. So, if you're kind of asking us, where would we predict? I think it's, where do you have arable land? Where do you have water? Where do you have access to maybe certain infrastructure, like urban infrastructure, so that you can actually market and process and slaughter and sell these products?
Thanks, Yukyan. And one other point I wanted to mention to that end is we wished we had the resources to go beyond 10 countries. We had to make this a manageable project, and it was a tough decision to draw the line at 10. But there were many other countries that we felt, this is an important issue, and maybe future efforts are going to allow us to look more closely at some of those other countries. Okay, lots of questions. Great. So when advocating on behalf of animals and LMICs, HSI often hears that IFAP has actually improved nutritional outcomes for the poor. Did you find any evidence of that or any data to challenge that narrative?
We didn't really find strong evidence on that, but we didn't, I would say, in terms of nutritional studies, come across that many to begin with. So it's hard to come with conclusions. The kinds of empirical quantitative studies that we actually found had to do more with what are the socioeconomic implications of IFAP? Do farmers, small-scale farmers who participate as contract farmers, do they do better than independent farmers? That, we found some studies and actually have come out on both ways of the answer. But on nutrition, I didn't come across any. I don't know, Keeve or Jillian, in your experience, just knowing the literature, if you have any comments.
I wouldn't be able to add that I've come across any literature that would be useful in at least addressing that question.
Mm-hmm. I would make a few points that you might already have thought about. I don't know for sure, and of course there are studies that show if people are food insecure, then access to more variety in their diet and more food in their diet, of course, will improve health outcomes if people do not have access to a nutritionally adequate diet. But there are differences, major differences in resource use and environmental degradation between highly valuable protein that you can put in your diet depending on what source it comes from. So there are high quality protein options that are not animal based. So there, and I'm sure that you have already looked into these issues. But of course, if someone is food insecure and they have access to more food or more variety in their diet and high quality protein, that would improve their health outcomes. But then we get to the question of who these products are going to. And there is evidence that products from IFAP are more likely to be going to the wealthier urban populations in LMICs as opposed to folks who are really struggling with food security, because the reason why corporations are interested in going into these markets is, of course, to make more money. So there are a lot of issues to unpack there, and we share your interest in that question. It's quite a large question, but we can bring in the sustainability and social justice questions into that underlying question.
Okay. So Mia says, as you may know, and not for public discussion yet, we've been talking with CLF about partnership on some of our projects in China around IFAP, some of which are supported by GRACE too. Have had discussions with Sean, Bob, and Becky and others, and I'm waiting to hear back. Well, Mia, I will take that as a gentle prompt to those people that we need to get in touch with you again. Jim asks, did you find studies on socioeconomic impacts of IFAP development in LMICs?
Yeah, there were a few. I would look at, there's what they call the pro-poor, I think, livestock initiative. There's, there were some researchers based on that initiative. I think they're affiliated maybe with FAO or working as consultants with FAO. Those studies are cited in this report. So I think, as Keeve mentioned, the report is much longer. We have actually annotated bibliographies on this. So I know that there are studies on that, and you can find that there, or if you don't see that in the bibliography list, you can definitely email us and we can send you what we found.
Yep. Okay, do we have any more questions? It looks like we may have exhausted our questions. Anyone have any more? Maybe we can give you another minute to chime in with additional questions. Otherwise, I think we're going to end our festivities for the day. Oh, here we go. Oops. Let's scroll away from that one. I don't think that's a question for everybody. Okay. Anything else? Okay, everyone, I think that is all we have, and thus concludes our webinar. I wanted to once again thank all of you for joining us today, and please stay in touch and follow up with any questions you may have, and hope you have a chance to really dive into the report. And we'll send you the slides. Thanks, everyone. Take care.